In this video I will explain how to replace the steering rack and pinion on 2005 to 2015 Toyota Tacoma pickup trucks. Step number 1. Park the truck on a flat surface, place blocks in front and behind the rear wheels, lift the front of the truck using a floor jack and place jack stands under the frame for safety. 2. Remove the power steering fluid reservoir cap and use a suction pump to extract some of the used power steering fluid. Disconnect the negative battery cable from the battery with a 10 mm wrench. Center and secure the steering wheel using the seat belt or a long strap as shown in the image to prevent the steering wheel from turning when performing the repair. 3. Remove the lug nuts that hold the front wheels using an impact tool and a 21 mm socket and proceed to remove both front wheels. 4. Draw a paint mark on both tie rod ends and proceed to loosen the locking nut using a 17 mm wrench. 5. Remove the 4 bolts that fasten the lower skid plate using a ratchet and a 12 mm socket. 6. Remove the cotter pin on both outer steering tie rod ends with needle nose pliers. 7. Loosen the outer tie rod end nut without removing it completely using a ratchet and a 17 mm socket. 8. Separate the outer tie rod end from the steering knuckle using a tie rod end separator or prying down on the tie rod while hitting the steering knuckle with a brass hammer near the area where both parts meet. Once free, remove the nut by hand and disconnect the outer tie rod end from the steering knuckle. Do that on both sides. 9. Remove the outer tie rod end on each side by turning it counterclockwise. Note, it is important to count the number of turns according to the mark you painted previously. Write down this number as it will serve as a reference when installing the new tie rod ends on the new steering gear in case it doesn't come equipped with the outer tie rod ends. 10. Remove the bolts that fasten both bridges using an impact tool or a ratchet and a 17 mm socket and remove the metal bridges. 11. Next, remove the bolts that fasten the stabilizer bar brackets using an impact tool or a ratchet and a socket and proceed to remove the brackets. 12. Remove the bolts that hold the bases of the steering hoses using a ratchet and a 12 mm socket. 13. Next, remove the base that holds the steering lines on the passenger side using a ratchet and a 10 mm socket as shown in the picture. 14. Place a container under the steering rack to collect the power steering fluid and proceed to disconnect the line from the left side using a 17 mm wrench as shown in the image. 15. Next, move the clamp of the other line using adjustable pliers and loosen the hose by hand so that it rotates freely when removing the line with a 17 mm wrench. 16. Next, remove the 2 long bolts that hold the steering rack with a 17 mm wrench from the top of the screw and an impact tool or ratchet and a 17 mm socket from the bottom as shown in the image. 17. Remove the steering shaft bolt with a 12 mm wrench as shown in the image. 18. Disconnect the steering shaft from the steering gear by inserting a bar into the steering shaft slot so that it opens slightly and with another bar as a lever so that it is completely released as shown in the image. 19. On 4-wheel drive models, place a floor jack under the front differential and proceed to remove the bolts that hold the front differential bases with a 19 mm wrench at the top, and an impact or ratchet tool and a 22 mm socket along the bottom as shown in the image. Once the bolts have been removed, lower the jack slightly to provide additional clearance. 20. Proceed to remove the rack in its entirety by pulling it to the side with your hand and then down as shown in the image. 21. Proceed to center the steering rack as follows. Place a cover or a small piece of hose on the helm of the input shaft of the steering gear to avoid damaging it and place a clamp on it as shown in the picture. Turn the input shaft using locking pliers in one direction until it reaches the stop. 22. Turn the input shaft in the opposite direction while counting the number of turns it takes to rotate it all the way in the opposite direction. Divide that number in 2 and proceed to turn the input shaft in the opposite direction the amount of turns you got by dividing the total travel in half. This will allow you to install the new steering gear at a centered position. Paint a paint mark on the input shaft and the body of the steering gear. Proceed to install the new steering gear on the truck and install the remaining components in the reverse order they were removed, ensuring that all bolts and fasteners are tightened at the specs listed in your owner's manual. Also, install the wheels back on and tighten the lug nuts using a lug wrench. You will need to do the final torque using a torque wrench once the truck is lowered to the ground. 23. Fill the power steering reservoir with new power steering fluid. Rotate the key to the on position so the steering wheel doesn't lock and proceed to turn the steering wheel in one direction till it reaches the end, followed by turning it in the opposite direction all the way. Do that a couple of times to bleed some of the air out. Once you have done it a couple of times, check the fluid level and add more fluid if needed. 24. Reconnect the battery cable back on. Start the engine and let it idle for a few seconds. Turn the engine off and check the fluid level on the power steering reservoir. Add more fluid if needed. Start the engine again, turn the steering wheel in both directions, check for fluid leaks, turn the engine off and check the fluid level one more time. If there are no fluid leaks, lower the truck to the ground and proceed to torque the wheel lug nuts to the specs listed in your owner's manual. Congratulate yourself for having performed a successful repair and for saving money at the same time. Have a wonderful day.